Following on from our last lesson, which was about sailors and shoemakers and the tactics of popular resistance to British authority, today's lesson follows the travails of a short man with a long and somewhat ridiculous name. His life, however, turns out to have been far from short and anything but ridiculous. Living to the grand old age of 98, George Robert Twelves Hewes was, as a young man in the 1770s, one of the linchpins of the American Revolution. A Boston shoemaker who participated in several Revolutionary-era events, not least the Boston Tea Party, an unprecedented act of domestic terrorism that would have dreadful consequences for relations between Crown and colonies and set the stage for the American Revolution. That few people have heard of this strangely named little fellow should not surprise you. As the brilliant scholarship of the historian Alfred Young has shown, despite Hughes's unique role in the founding of this country, he grew up poor and remained poor throughout his life. Obscure and unheralded, almost until his death in 1840, he was, as I'll argue today, a nobody who, for a few brief moments in the early 1770s, made choices that made him a somebody. George Robert Twelves Hewes was born in Boston in 1742, and if you're wondering, the Twelves was a family name. His dad was a tanner who died when George was only 7. As soon as George was old enough, his mother sent him out to work as an apprentice, learning to make shoes. And shoemaking was just about the most humble profession there was, and George was not happy about it. But because he was only 5'1", he was too short and too weak to be a butcher or anything else more physically demanding. So a shoemaker's apprentice he grudgingly became. Disobedient and resentful both at home and at work, George was a bit of a terror growing up. He ran away from home more than once and had to be sent to live with his uncle to learn some discipline. Twice he tried to abandon his apprenticeship, even trying to join the colonial militia in 1760 during the French and Indian War. But he was rejected. Sent home by the recruiting officer for being fully 7 inches shorter than the minimum required height, George returned the next day wearing platform shoes that he had made in his master's workshop. The recruiting officer recognized him and sent him home a second time. So George Robert Twelves Hewes was stuck with shoemaking. And when he finally completed his apprenticeship, he got married to a washerwoman named Sally and set up his own workshop. And that workshop was not large, and it wasn't profitable either. And George was in and out of debtor's prison as he struggled to pay the workshop's mortgage. He and Sally lived in rented rooms, never even earning enough between the two of them to have to pay any income tax. George's life was not going well. And so he was not pleased when, in 1769, a customer skipped out on a bill for a pair of shoes. And the customer in question was one of the British soldiers garrisoned in Boston to keep order following the 1767 Townshend Acts. So Hewes complained to the man's commanding officer, a certain Captain Thomas Preston, whose name I hope you recognize from an earlier lesson. Taking this humble shoemaker's complaint surprisingly seriously, Preston had the soldier lashed 50 times, a punishment that even Hewes thought was brutal and over the top. About a year later, on the evening of March the 5th, 1770, George Robert Twelves Hewes was working at his shop when he heard an apprentice yelling about something. Hewes followed the sound and wound up on King Street in time to see townsfolk he knew hurling snow, ice, and other missiles at a lone British sentry. Before he could blink, he had been pushed out of the way, almost knocked to the ground by a crew of redcoat reinforcements rushing to the scene. A few seconds of confusion and terror later, shots had been fired, and 5 men lay dead or dying. All were working men, like Hewes himself. In fact, 4 were friends of his. Beside himself with rage, Hewes rushed home to arm himself, returning to King Street with a cane and spoiling for a fight. But before he could wreak bloody vengeance on the soldiers still gathered there, a brawny sergeant snatched Hewes's weapon from him, sending this little man home to howl in protest and frustration. During the trials of Captain Preston and his men, Hewes would testify to try to get them convicted for murder. Under oath, he swore that he had seen Preston give the order to fire. Though when he was cross-examined by Preston's lawyer, John Adams, Hewes had to admit that from where he'd been standing, he couldn't possibly have seen the captain's lips move. Three years later, after dark on the evening of December the 16th, 1773, George Robert Twelves Hewes would be one of the 100 or more Bostonians to destroy 46 tons of British tea in Boston Harbor. This Boston Tea Party was a response to the 1773 Tea Act, the latest of a series of British government directives stretching back to the Stamp Act of 1765. Only the Tea Act was not supposed to have been controversial. On the contrary, it was intended to reduce tea smuggling within the British Empire and thereby boost the sales of tea legally imported to the American colonies by the East India Company, a mega corporation that had strong ties to the British government. To reduce smuggling, the Tea Act actually lowered taxes on East India Company tea imported to America, thereby making the company's tea more competitive with untaxed Dutch tea that was being smuggled in illegally. On the face of it, then, you'd think that most colonists would find nothing in the Tea Act to complain about. However, as it turns out, smuggling was very big business in the city of Boston. In 1771, for instance, so 2 years before the Tea Act was passed, one Boston official estimated that 83% of the tea drunk in the city was smuggled tea. No surprise, then, that many wealthy and middling merchants, including John Hancock himself, saw the 1773 Tea Act as a direct threat to the income they derived from smuggling. They went to the press, denouncing the new Tea Act as tyrannical and monopolistic and as a threat to free trade. They called it slavery, and their accomplices even sent death threats and attacked the homes of local merchants who legally imported East India Company tea. In December of 1773, 3 ships arrived in Boston Harbor, laden with East India Company tea. By this time, John Hancock and the city's other smuggling interests had persuaded Sam Adams and his group, the Sons of Liberty, that the Tea Act was an attack on colonial liberty. So when these 3 tea ships tried to unload their cargo, to be taxed and then legally sold, Sam Adams and other local leaders intervened, laying plans to board those ships and destroy the tea instead. Keenly aware that they were about to destroy massive amounts of private property and infuriate the British government by doing so, the 100 or so men who boarded those ships on the night of December the 16th swore oaths of secrecy. And they wore Native American disguises made of tar, paint, soot, or grease, so as not to be recognized. Riled up by drink and watched by 2,000 silent friends and family members lined up on Griffin's Wharf, they went to work. Most were politically active artisans, craftsmen, and young traders, with ties of loyalty or livelihood to wealthy merchant families like the Hancocks. Some had been out on King Street 3 years earlier, on the night the Redcoats had opened fire on the rabble. Others, like Ebenezer McIntosh, who you may remember from one of our earlier lessons, had taken part in the Stamp Act protests, or knew each other from church organizations or from drinking clubs. Probably the shortest man there that night was George Robert Twelves Hewes. Perhaps persuaded by all the propaganda in the papers, he had been roped in by his brother Daniel, who was a member of the Sons of Liberty. To disguise his features, Hewes had daubed his face and hands with coal dust from a blacksmith shop. And because he was a good whistler, Hewes had been given a leading role. Whistling to a group of men to follow him, Hewes boarded one of those 3 tea-ships, found its terrified captain, took his keys, and used them to open the hatches. Captain Hewes, as some of his fellow vandals later referred to him, found the tea in the hold below and organized teams to hoist the chests above deck, break them open, and hurl them into the water. His job done, Hewes made to leave the ship and to disappear back into the night. But as he was disembarking, he saw another of the tea destroyers filling his coat pockets with tea leaves, trying to steal some of the tea they'd all pledged to destroy. Furious, George Robert Twelves Hewes grabbed the man by his coat before he could make his escape. The coat tore, the 2 men fought briefly, and the thief then threatened to have Hewes arrested for assault. "You had better make your will first," George Robert Twelves Hewes spat back, balling his little fist as if to punch him. The man fled, leaving his torn coat at Hughes's feet. The next day, Hewes later recalled, we nailed the skirt of his coat, which I had pulled off, to the whipping post in the place of his residence, with a label upon it to shame him by popular indignation. Before we turn to what happened next, let's just rewind back a little bit and look again at something that we might have missed. Those Native American disguises that those tea destroyers used that night. What was that about? Why might they have chosen to disguise themselves this way? If you're going to dress up to destroy British tea, why dress up as a Native American to do it? There's clearly a lot going on there. And for my money, 3 explanations deserve special notice. First, let's be clear, the trespassers on those ships were not trying to look silly. They were trying to look terrifying. And certainly some onlookers were intimidated by the sight of them. Anne Holton, the sister of a customs officer, later testified that she had been frequently alarmed with the Sons of Liberty surrounding her house that night, with the most hideous howling of the Indians when they attack an enemy. Second, by wearing a disguise, the Vandals probably gained some much-needed courage for what they were about to do. Being unrecognizable under your war paint, impersonating Mohawk warriors no less, might give you the confidence to do things that you're not brave enough to do otherwise. And third, I think they were trying to draw a contrast between themselves and the British. By putting on primitive, native disguises, they were trying to find a visual language to contrast with and to criticize decadent, tyrannical Britain. In fact, over the next few years, that comparison between colonists and Indians would become quite popular in the press. Paul Revere made at least 3 engravings depicting colonists or even America itself as Indian. In the days and weeks after destroying all of that tea, George Robert Twelves Hewes walked with his chest puffed out, proud to be a man who'd taken a stand. No surprise then that when a month later he came across a local customs official, John Malcolm, cursing and damning and threatening to batter with his cane a small boy who'd crossed him, Hewes was quick to step between them. "Mr. Malcolm," Hewes said boldly, I hope you are not going to strike this boy with that stick." John Malcolm was apparently not impressed by this little man's misplaced courage. "You are an impertinent rascal," Malcolm scowled. "It is none of your business. You are a vagabond and should know better than to address a gentleman in the street in that manner." This was the wrong thing to say to George Robert Twelves Hewes. 5 feet of fury and self-importance ignited in a second. "I am neither a rascal nor a vagabond, and though a poor man, am in as good credit in town as you," Hewes shot back. John Malcolm would hear no more and struck the shoemaker on the head with his cane, hitting him so hard that the blow nearly penetrated his skull. Hewes fell to the floor, unconscious. When he came to his senses, John Malcolm was gone. When he was sufficiently recovered, Hewes tried to press charges, swearing an oath for John Malcolm's arrest for assault and battery. But by then, news of Hughes's beating had got out, and townsfolk had taken justice into their own hands, dragging this long-hated customs official John Malcolm from his house. According to the papers, the mob proceeded to elevate Mr. Malcolm into a cart, and stripping him to buff and breeches, gave him a modern jacket, a coat of tar and feathers, and hied him away to the Liberty Tree, where they proposed to him to renounce his present commission as a customs official, and swear that he would never hold another position inconsistent with the liberties of his country. But this he obstinately refusing, they then carted him to the gallows, passed a rope round his neck, and threw the other end over the beam as if they intended to hang him. But this maneuver he set at defiance. They then basted him for some time with a rope's end and threatened to cut his ears off. And on this, he complied, and they then brought him home. As you can imagine, John Malcolm was shaken and humbled by that experience. A fact that became very obvious when he saw the little shoemaker in the street a few weeks later. "How do you do, Mr. Malcolm?" Hewes asked. "Your humble servant, Mr. George Robert Twelves Hewes," Malcolm replied, touching his hat in a gesture of respect normally reserved for greeting fellow gentlemen. The shoemaker walked on in triumph. By late spring of 1774, news had reached London of John Malcolm's tarring and feathering, as had news of the Tea Party before it, and of other destructive responses to the Tea Act in the colonies since then. As you can imagine, officials in London were furious that the Tea Act, a piece of legislation, remember, that lowered law-abiding colonists' taxes, had been so ungratefully received. To bring those rebellious colonists to heel, Parliament now responded with not one, but 4 new pieces of legislation. Each was punitive, each was extreme. First came the Boston Port Act, which closed that city's docks until its people admitted their guilt and paid for the cost of the ruined tea. Next was the Massachusetts Government Act, a power grab that gave Crown officials authority to fill seats in the Massachusetts legislature. The Third Act allowed soldiers and customs officials arrested by American law enforcement to be extradited home to England to be tried there, not in America. The fourth of these laws was a new Quartering Act that reasserted the British government's right to occupy the colonies. And to enforce all of this, Parliament dispatched more redcoat regiments to Boston. Many colonists thought these coercive acts were almost impossibly harsh, outrageous, intolerable. George Robert Twelves Hewes certainly felt that way. And when fighting broke out between Crown and colonies 18 months later, Hewes enlisted in the Massachusetts militia. But he never rose above the rank of private and served in uniform for only about 9 months, less than many other patriots. And that's because he was needed at home. There were mouths to feed, lots of them. In all, Sally had borne him 15 children, the last of which, the 15th, they actually named George Robert Twelves 15 Hewes. That little joke aside, the Hewes had little else to smile about. The British had commandeered George's workshop during the war and torn it down before they had retreated from Boston. With his city in ruins, Hewes headed west after the war, relocating his family to Otsego County, New York. But things there proved to be little better. Over the next few decades, he struggled to find work, and so did his children. When Sally died in 1828, George quickly became a charity case. He was able to secure a small veteran's pension of about $60 a year for his service in the Massachusetts militia. But in 1832, the year that pension was finally approved, $60 a year was hardly enough for even a frail old man to live on. Then, in the mid-1830s, something unexpected happened. George Robert Twelves Hewes became a celebrity. And the reason was his age. Now in his 90s, and sharp as ever, Hewes was discovered by two biographers eager to exploit patriotic interest in the Revolution stirred by the 50th anniversary celebrations of 1826. Suddenly, Hewes was famous, and in the years before he died in 1840, he could be found leading 4th of July parades, happily giving interviews about his revolutionary exploits, and even sitting for a portrait. Not everything the old man said in those media interviews was entirely true. But at least one of the fibs he told turns out to be quite revealing. Describing that famous night on Griffin's Wharf back in 1773 to a biographer in 1834, Hewes recalled standing alongside John Hancock himself. The two of them working together to break open a chest of tea and throw it overboard into Boston's muddy harbor. Hewes claimed to have recognized the great man right away that night, not only by his ruffles making their appearance in the heat of the work, from under the disguise which pretty thoroughly covered him, and by his figure and gait, but by his features, which neither his paint nor his loosened club of hair behind wholly concealed from a close view. And by his voice also, for he exchanged, with me, an Indian grunt. Now, we know from many other sources that John Hancock was nowhere near the docks that night, so as not to be collared as the kingpin behind this terrorist action. Hancock had stayed in the city center. But Hewes did not remember it that way in 1834. On the contrary, by placing Hancock on the ship and at his side, Hughes's memory of that night made these two men equals, not superior and subordinate, not rich merchant and lowly shoemaker, but partners in a common cause. That Hewes invented such a scene and remembered it that way so many decades later demonstrates to me how events like the Tea Party and the dressing down of John Malcolm, the customs official, soon afterwards, succeeded in giving ordinary folk like this little man with the long name a sense of citizenship and of personal worth, turning a nobody into a somebody. The American Revolution seems to have made George Robert Twelves Hewes very happy indeed.